So this question about the conflict between, say, a human right to health or any human rights and then private property. That's essentially what we're talking about when we talk about IP. We're talking about private property. This is my idea. I should be able to profit from it. And therefore, you think that you have a right to that thing which I created, and it doesn't make sense to me. So this idea of a conflict between private property and the public sort of good or somebody else's human rights has been a long-standing issue in any democratic country. It's not a new thing, and it's not just about access to medications. So if it was true that that simply there has been no clear agreement, at least in political philosophy, about how much everything that you do, you own yourself, right? Because you, as a person who's created things, whatever property it might be, whether it might be Facebook or whether it might be your little garden and the vegetables that you've cooked, no matter what, you are a product of a social environment. And that social environment has provided various things to you, right? So the safety of safe roads, the soldiers that protect your country, the water that's clean, the educational system that has influenced you, all of that is social inputs into your productivity. And so therefore, at various points, different countries, different states, different courts have said, look, nobody is an island unto themselves creating their own intellectual property and therefore they own all of it. Is that in society we have contributed to your particular productivity, and therefore one of the reasons why we tax you is because of that idea that you have a contribution to make and we've also contributed to your stuff. So this is not just about intellectual property. You're almost asking the question, can you tax anybody for their labor, right? So if you don't think people should be taxed, then we have a much bigger conversation to have about what you think, where you are and stuff. But in terms of IP, particularly around medications, let's be clear of the fact that it's very rarely the case that a pharmaceutical company 100% funds their research by their own private resources, right? So what goes into whatever that they are creating or discovering has at some point drawn on public resources. So whether it be the people that have been educated, that have sort of made discoveries in an educational institution or a government institution, then move over to the private sector, or the pharmaceutical company has used various kinds of research that the government has funded in a variety of different ways, or the research that have been done prior to and then will build on it in a private enterprise and all that stuff. So the notion about intellectual property is that the product is often interwoven with public resources from long way back or more immediately and stuff. So it has to be a much more nuanced and delicate understanding of where the balance is between private enterprise and private profit versus giving back, in sort of public enterprise as well. There was two answers to both of those different parts of questions. So on the one hand, I think people who think of human rights as rights to discrete things are wrong. They're conceptually wrong, and they are harming the movement in the long sort of story. So when people say, I have a human right to a pill, I think is a really wasted argument and a wasted opportunity to make something about themselves. I think if you say something like, human beings have a human right or a right to be healthy, then it covers a much more kind of meaningful sort of scope of activity. So within that, people say, well, nevertheless, I think that human rights guarantees individuals access to medications. Then we can talk much more specifically about under what circumstances do they have a right to access to medications, and what sort of domestic context and what sort of global context do they have a right to medications. But if they're very specific and say, I have, or people have a human right to this particular drug that this company makes, I think they're going to get weaker and weaker on that kind of grounding because there isn't that particular argument. If that is the only drug available in the world for their particular condition, and they're trying to find an argument, I think I can understand the issue of trying to use the language of human rights to make a claim on it, but I think they need to be much more careful and sort of argue why they think that a particular individual has that right to that particular drug, which is the only drug available for their treatment. The other side of this equation where you said, well, how do you draw the balance between private enterprise and public good? Like, how do you divide up the issue here? I think it has to be on a case-by-case basis. So we have in the history of medicine and history of healthcare some people who have basically discovered something and given it out as a public good. They've said, I think polio is one example where somebody says, this is for the world, I give it. And people have benefited from this person's largesse. So that's one end of the extreme where somebody says, I don't want to make a profit from it, I will give it to the world and make use of it. While another person might simply say, no, I want 100% profit. I want to set the bar and stuff like that. So in terms of trying to figure out where this lies, part of it has to be, I think, on the ethical reasoning of the people who are making these things and trying to say, how much of this should we sort of, what is a reasonable profit from my labor here, and how much of it should we be sort of benefiting the good? And the second thing is that if a third party has to go in there and decide, then they're going to have to do by case basis and say, well, how much of this is really your own private productive means versus the public contribution to this particular good. And so if you want to profit from it, fine, then we're going to proportionally profit from our contribution to this effort as well.